Alright guys, this is Don't Export, and I just picked up the package with the RX 6800, so let's open it, shall we? That is the package, so I got the Asus version. I mean, they're all exactly the same, so but this was the one that they had in stock. Now let's see if we can get this tape off. It's packed in quite tight, there we go. Different version, but anyway, so here it is. Okay, so you get some, with the Asus edition you get a bunch of stickers. I guess that can come in handy if you want to, I don't know. Oops, yeah, there we go. So, yeah, so this is the card. It looks pretty good. In my opinion, it's very heavy. So the fan shroud is aluminum, and yeah, the whole construction is aluminum. There's very little plastic. I believe the fans are plastic. Yeah, the fans are plastic, obviously. But yeah, that's a card.
So let's quickly run down some specs. The RX 6800 has 16 GB of VRAM and a memory bandwidth of up to 512 GB per second. Additionally, it has 128 MB of Infinity Cache, and there are 60 compute units, each with its own Ray accelerator, and 3840 stream processors. The boost frequency is 2105 MHz, and the game clock frequency is 1815 MHz. Although this card maintained the boost frequency and then some in pretty much every game I tested. The outputs are one HDMI 2.1 and two DisplayPorts 1.4, along with a USB-C port, which you can use as a display output or a regular USB-C port. It supports quick charging as well, according to my phone. Now it's time to test the cooler. We kick off with noise. This is measured 30 centimeters away from the fans on an open-air test bench, and here the reference RX 6800 measured 44 dBA when under load. This is good for a reference design, I would say, and it's certainly an improvement over the usual blower designs. You can lower the fan speed to target 40 dBA if you so desire. Let's take a look at fan speed. At stock, the fan spun at 1668 RPM, 1668 RPM. When under load, that's not bad, but to target 40 dBA, we have to lower the fan speed to 1445 RPM, and at this point, the card will, of course, run a bit hotter. Which brings us to temperature. At stock, the temperature reached 69 degrees Celsius in a 22-degree room, and this is a good result. Lowering the fan speeds to target 40 dBA increases the temperature, of course, to 77 degrees Celsius in a 22-degree room, and it's okay, it should be safe, but yeah. So here's a noise demonstration for you. Now let's get into the gaming performance. The test system used was an Intel i5-10600K at 4.9 GHz with 4.8 GHz cache clock and 16 GB of DDR4 memory running in dual channel at 4266 MHz with 16-16-16-34 timings. Even so, we are somewhat CPU limited at 1080p in some games. Kicking things off with ANNO 1800 at 1080p, the RX 6800 edges out the 3070, but they deliver pretty similar performance here at 1080p. Additionally, it is 49% ahead of the 5700 XT. Moving up to 1440p, and now the 6800 is 6% ahead of the 3070 and 50% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, it's the same delta between the 6800 and the 3070, and that remains true for the 5700 XT as well. Next game is Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and here at 1080p, the RX 6800 is slightly ahead of the 3070, but there is something limiting our performance. At 1440p, the RX 6800 is able to pull away from the rest of the cards and is now 30% ahead of the 3070 and the rest of the pack. I retested the 3070 because I thought it was a bit weird that it performed the way it did, but I got the same results, so there it is. Moving to 4K, and now the RX 6800 is only 11% ahead of the 3070, with both pulling away from the 2070 Super and 5700 XT. Next up is Assetto Corsa Competitzione, and this surprised me, given that the 5700 XT was outclassed by the 2070 Super in a big way in this title. Actually, I retested the 5700 XT after I uploaded this video, and had to redo this because The performance is actually up in Assetto Corsa Competitzione with the latest drivers, so it now performs about the same as the 2070 Super, so I just had to get that in there. I expected the RX 6800 to be behind or on par with the 3070, but boy was I wrong. I don't know what AMD has done, if it's the Infinity Cache or driver optimizations, but the 6800 absolutely killed it at 1080p. It is actually 20% ahead of the 3070 and about twice as fast as the 5700 XT. Very impressive in a title I thought favored Nvidia. Still impressive at 1440p with 168 frames per second on average. It's now down to 12% ahead of the 3070, but it's still roughly twice as fast as the 5700 XT. As with the 5700 XT, the 6800 is weakest at 4K, and it's now delivering similar performance to the 3070, actually 0.5 of a frame behind on average, but still twice the FPS of the 5700 XT. Next game is Battlefield 5, and here we actually ran into a game engine limitation. The game engine is limited to 200 frames per second, and the 6800 did 198.5 frames per second on average, basically hitting that 200 frames per second limit throughout the benchmarking run. The result then is that it is 25% ahead of the 3070 and 5700 XT, which performs similarly at this resolution. 1440p is next, and now that we are not bouncing off the FPS limiter, the 6800 delivered 172.3 frames per second on average, and as such it is now 47% ahead of the 3070. DirectX 11 performance in Battlefield 5 is pretty impressive on the RDNA GPUs. 4K remains the 6800's weakest showing, but it still managed 93 frames per second on average, beating out the 3070 by 28% and 5700 XT by 54%. Next up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare. At 1080p, the 6800 managed 169.5 frames per second on average, which makes it 9% faster than the 3070 and 32% faster than the 5700 XT. 1440p is next, and here the 6800 is up to 14% ahead of the 3070, indicating we may have been slightly CPU limited at 1080p. In addition, it is 36% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, we are back down to a 10% lead over the 3070, which makes sense given that 4K is where the RDNA cards are a bit less impressive. So the next game is Control, and here the 3070 is edging out the RX 6800. However, the 6800 is still a decent 53% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 1440p, the 3070 is 5% faster than the 6800, but the 6800 is 56% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, the 3070 is extending its lead to 16%, but the delta between the 6800 and 5700 XT remained the same. So let's move on to Devil May Cry 5. At 1080p, the 6800 did 251.1 frames per second on average, which makes it 9% faster than the 3070 and 44% faster than the 5700 XT. Moving up to 1440p lowers the average FPS to 109.3 frames per second on average. Still plenty, and that makes it 21% ahead of the 3070 and 63% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, the 6800 is down to a 12% lead over the 3070, but still has a healthy 66% lead over the 5700 XT. The Division 2 is the next game we are looking at, and at 1080p, the 6800 managed 162.3 frames per second average, which makes it 14% faster than the 3070 and 52% faster than the 5700 XT. At 1440p, it's more the same, slightly less of a lead. The lead over the 3070 is now down to 13%, but 53% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, we again see the 6800's lead deteriorate, and it's now only 7% faster than the 3070. Next up is Doom Eternal, and at 1080p we are over 300 frames per second on average, and that makes it 9% faster than the 3070, but 48% faster than the 5700 XT. Cranking up the resolution to 1440p, and now the 6800 delivered 240 frames per second average, making it 15% faster than the 3070, and still 48% faster than the 5700 XT. At 4K, the 6800 still manages to not only hold on to a lead, but actually extend it slightly. It is here 20% faster than the 3070, and that was unexpected. But the one potential reason for this, and I am speculating here, is that Doom wants more than 8GB of VRAM at Ultra Nightmare settings at 4K. That could be it, but I don't know. Now let's move on. Next game is Forza Horizon 4, and after a comment on the 3070 review claiming that the 5700 XT's performance had improved in Forza with the latest drivers, I retested it and performance was indeed up. I don't know if this was only due to the driver or something else going on, but these numbers are accurate. I also retested the Nvidia cards just in case there was something else going on, but they remained at the same performance level. So at 1080p, the 6800 did 220.2 frames per second average, which means it is 15% ahead of the 3070 and 29% ahead of the 5700 XT, which is now on par with the 2070 Super. At 1440p, the delta remains about the same, with the 6800 being 14% faster than the 3070, but up to 34% faster than the 5700 XT. At 4K, we again see the 6800's lead diminish, and it is now down to 12% ahead of the 3070, but 43% ahead of the 5700 XT. So it does look like the performance of the 6800 doesn't take as large of a hit at 4K as the 5700 XT, at least not in Forza. Next game then is Ghost Recon Breakpoint. At 1080p, the 6800 did 135.7 frames per second average, which was 8% ahead of the 3070 and 35% ahead of the 5700 XT. Moving up to 1440p. Here the 6800 was 10% faster than the 3070 and 32% faster than the 5700 XT. At 4K, the 6800 is now down to 5% faster than the 3070 and 30% faster than the 5700 XT. Moving on to the Outer Worlds, and here the 6800 is actually behind the 3070 at 1080p. It's a bit surprising, seeing as the 6800 was faster in Assetto Corsa, which is also an Unreal Engine 4 game. But anyway, the 3070 is 2% ahead of the 6800 at 1080p, but the 6800 is 42% ahead of the 5700 XT, so that's good. At 1440p, the 3070 is now 3% ahead of the 6800, but there isn't much in it really, so let's see how the 6800 fares at 4K. So, at 4K, the 3070 is now 7% faster than the 6800 XT, which was expected, really. Next is Rainbow Six Siege. At 1080p, the 6800 delivered a massive 438 frames per second average, making it 18% faster than the 3070. At 1440p, the lead increased to 28% over the 3070 and 54% ahead of the 5700 XT. At 4K, the lead is now down to 13% over the 3070. Second to last game now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. At 1080p, the 6800 takes a 9% lead over the 3070 and 45% lead over the 5700 XT. At 1440p, we are now up to a 16% lead over the 3070, indicating we were slightly CPU limited at 1080p. In addition, it is now 60% faster than the 5700 XT. 4K, and here it managed to average over 60 FPS, which makes it 14% faster than the 3070 and 68% faster than the 5700 XT. The last title is The Witcher 3, and now you're probably thinking WTF. This is not a mistake, the 6800 is indeed slower than a 2070 Super at 1080p in The Witcher 3. So here we are CPU limited, and I suspect that the drivers are what makes the 6800 so slow. Slow. While benchmarking, the GPU usage was well below 100% and even 90%, which means that, in my opinion, we are looking at the CPU limitation through the AMD drivers, which simply is not present with the NVIDIA drivers. So the result then is that the 3070 is 17% faster than the 6800 at 1080p. But if we increase the resolution to 1440p, the tables have turned, and the 6800 is now 15% faster than the 3070 and 55% faster than the 5700 XT. So, relative performance then. And I have changed from showing it in percent to showing the actual 15 game average FPS. So at 1080p, the RX 6800 is on average 9% faster than the 3070 and 42% faster than the 5700 XT. At 1440p, that is up to 17% ahead of the 3070 and 53% ahead of the 5700 XT, which makes me wonder how much faster the 6700 XT will be compared to the 5700 XT. I expect around 30%, but we will see. At 4K, the 6800 is 10% ahead of the 3070 and 56% ahead of the 5700 XT on average. So next up is value at 1440p. This is pretty similar between the 6800 and 3070. Both of these are only slightly better value than the 5700 XT, and the decision between a 6800 and a 3070 might come down to VRAM versus ray tracing performance. The 6800 has twice the VRAM of the 3070, but the 3070 is better at ray tracing, which we will see. But before we get to ray tracing, I did some overclocking. So I maxed out the memory slider in Wattman and changed the memory to fast timings, which is apparently a setting in Wattman, in addition to maxing the power slider, which is only plus 15% by the way. I managed to set the core clock to 2460 MHz, but the actual clock speed was a bit lower. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare we saw a 7% increase in performance, and in Shadow of the Tomb Raider we saw the same 7% increase in performance. Overclocking will of course depend on your silicon quality, and I personally don't expect the AIB cards to be any better in this regard. We are unable to increase voltage or power beyond 15%, and to those of you hoping for a fix, Igor's lab has already tested BIOS modding and found that you can increase the max memory speed through BIOS, but he also found that when trying to increase the voltage or power limit through BIOS, the card downclocks to 568 MHz. So for now you will not be able to push the core clock any further, and again the AIB models will highly likely have the same limitations. So a link to Igor's lab article is in the description if you are curious. Now then it's time to get to ray tracing performance, and this has been quite a hot topic on certain platforms, but let's see how it fares in my tests. So starting off with Battlefield 5, in this graph is getting a bit cramped. Sorry about that. I will split it into resolutions in the future, but for now the 3070 is 28% faster than the 6800, and this is up to 35% at 4K. Call of Duty Modern Warfare is next, and this game does not support DLSS as far as I know. And here the RTX 3070 is 21% faster than at 1080p with ray tracing on, and that's down to 11% at 1440p and 6% at 4K. So pretty opposite of regular rasterized performance there. Usually the 6800 is weaker at the higher resolutions, but here it actually gained on the 3070 for some reason. Next is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and again the 3070 is 28% faster at 1080p, and that is actually down to only 8% at 1440p and 7% at 4K. Last up is Control, and the 3070 is 34% ahead at 1080p, and the 6800 is performing about the same as the 2070 Super, so the delta at 1440p and 4K is also between 30 and 40%, and I know some of you are probably thinking, but with the Nvidia cards you can enable DLSS, and yes, you are correct, you can. So I tested with DLSS on the 3070 set to balanced mode where possible, which is in Control. With DLSS you can actually play with ray tracing in 4K with the 3070 with playable frame rates as long as you use it in performance mode, which renders at 1080p. Balanced renders at 1440p and will give you 1440p performance. This means that the Nvidia cards are much better suited to ray tracing at this point in time. Now I know AMD is working on something similar to DLSS, but right now that is not available. But in every title here that supports DLSS, the 3070 is a lot faster than the RX 6800, and the ray tracing performance of the 6800 is basically on par with the first generation RTX cards, and it's a bit faster than the 2070 Super while costing, well, more than the 2070 Super did, and it also costs more than the 3070 costs now. And again, enabling DLSS will have the 2070 Super also in front of the 6800, sadly. So let's look at efficiency. And I'm changing the way I measure performance per watt, so instead of doing it in one particular game, I'm using the power draw while running Firestrike Ultra divided by the 1440p 15 game average frame rate, and this is due to some games running better on one particular brand, so the 15 game average should eliminate that. So the 6800 is a bit more power efficient than the 3070 and quite a bit more efficient than the Aorus 5700 XT, but yeah, so let's look at power consumption. Here we have power consumption while running Firestrike Ultra stress test. The RX 6800 pulled through 312 watts from the PSU's 12-volt rail, 4 watts more than the 3070, but 22 watts less than the Aorus 5700 XT. Not bad this, and a 650 watt power supply should suffice. While testing, the peak power consumption at the 12-volt rail was around 450 watts, I believe, with the i5-10600K overclocked. So then for the conclusion, starting with grading the card, if I still had the build quality grade, this thing would get an A, but I'm not grading build quality anymore, so yeah, it doesn't. So for noise, this thing receives a C. For temperature, it is actually an A. And the AMD RX 6800 is a good GPU, and I am happy to report I did not encounter any driver issues while testing. And I do actually recommend this if you can get a hold of one. As with these 3000 series from Nvidia and the 5000 series CPUs from AMD, stock was gone pretty quick, so you might have a hard time finding one. AIB models are launching on the 25th, and I would try to get one of those if you want the 6800. Every one of them should be at least as good as this thing. although I do fear some of them will be quite a bit more expensive. I actually paid close to 100 USD over what was supposed to be the MSRP in this country, Norway. So now this was also true for the 3070, and I can't wait for these supply issues to be over and prices coming back down, but it doesn't look like that will happen anytime soon. Anyway, the RX 6800 is a good card, but it's not the top choice for ray tracing. Rasterized performance though is great, and yeah, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Now I have to benchmark these two at 3440 by 1440. So I see you guys later. Thank you for watching, and farewell for now.